So good evening, everyone. As Will said, my name's Jenny and I run a research and design agency called Studio Aikieu. And ultimately what our studio does is we work at the intersection of design, research, society and business. And the ambition of the studio is that we bring together different agents to work towards a common goal, which is to imagine a better future and truly making it actionable. So how we work is we have a very open, flexible methodology where we work between the space between abstraction and reality. And it's within this framework that we always start every project through problematization. So what we do is we start to imagine what problems might evolve over time and space due to human intervention or techno innovation. And by imagining what those problems might be, we believe that's the only way we can start to design solutions to mitigate those potential scenarios. Now, much of the work begins often within the realm of design fiction, but what we always try to do is to go beyond speculation. And what we try to do within that is we want to bring the complex and the intangible into the present day to enable us to work towards a preferable future, one that's obtainable, sustainable, inclusive, and beneficial for all. When we work within that framework, we always try to consider the global drivers and shifts that may impact our future. So from political to economic uncertainty, to climate change, to techno innovation. And it's all with the ambition to design for greater resilience and sustainable solutions that enable us to live within our planetary means. And to do this, we really see our role as a designer is to kind of facilitate and inspire action, is to empower others by providing them with the tools and know-how, and to provide support to mobilize our communities. And it's through these small actions, through inclusivity and transparency, that we feel that only then can we begin to advocate and see change. So in our studio, we work with primarily three principles. We recognize that we're an ecosystem and we have this ambition to foster an ethos of care. We know that we are only one organism in a community of 8.7 million, and that we're very much codependent on humans and non-humans for survival and sustaining ourselves. And we also hope to act within our planetary boundaries. Now, when we talk about Earth, we know that Earth is home to millions of species, but only one dominates it, and that's us. There are 7.6 billion people on this planet, but we actually only represent 0.01% of all living things. But it's because of our ambition that we've almost modified every part of our planet. We know that when it comes to species that we have had such a great impact on the planet. What we haven't known until now is how do we quantify that? So based on our current technosphere, the total sum of our material output on Earth is over 30 trillion tons. And what this figure demonstrates is that this has more than doubled prior to human civilization of Earth. So when we look at today's global production, we know that it doesn't fully operate on a sustainable model. Instead, we are over-exploiting nature without truly collaborating with it. We are in essence living in the age of overconsumption. Now, when we talk about designing for a sustainable future, whether that's from a societal or technological point of view or material point of view, if we look at the context of materials, we always have the ambition to develop the next generation of materials or technology that primarily does less harm or designs out waste. But when we talk about innovation, we know that it needs to go beyond that. It's not just about doing less harm, it's also about finding solutions that replenishes and restores what we've actually taken. So before we can even go into that realm, it's important to really challenge our mindset and behaviors towards nature to design a future where all species, humans or otherwise, has equal equity. So I want to show you two key projects that we worked on that really frames kind of the direction of the studio and some of our ambitions and ultimately some of the principles that really drive what we do. So in 2015, we delivered a project called Plants Out of Place. And the ambition of the project was really focused on re-examining our relationship with nature, in particular weeds. And it was really to fully understand the role that it plays in how it contributes to sustaining both human and non-human life. Now, when we think about the very term weeds, it's a human construct, one that we've created and used because we see nature as a pest. It's ultimately grown in places that we don't want in our carefully cultivated lawns. And in human society, we try to control nature. We take for granted the role that it plays. And ultimately, it's this very desire, behavior, mindset that has created, or more accurately, destroyed the ecosystem in which we have today. So if we look at our role today in the 21st century, we know that with rapid industrialization and techno-innovation, that it's really changed the role that we played many, many years ago. And that's the role from hunter-gatherer, where it was very critical for us to work with, respect, and understand nature, to today's modern day consumer, where the ease and simplicity of our supply and demand systems means that we no longer need to understand where do things come from, or how things are made, or to be even aware of nature's role and its contribution. So within that context and those kind of provocations, it really led us to imagine and question that what if in the future our supply and demand systems failed and our very infrastructure collapsed? Are we truly equipped for survival? What does that scenario look like? So from our research, we really learned a lot about the various roles in which these humble plants play. They can do things from food detection. They can also support us from a biological defense point of view. And then of course, the things that we are most reliant on, material application and medicine. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, we saw that certain services like healthcare was already overstretched. And for some countries, food shortages became very critical. So there was a greater need and awareness that in the future, we need to start to create self-sustaining systems that enable us to not only be self-sufficient, but also to reduce our over-reliance on our modern day systems. But part of that ambition also requires us to change our relationship with nature, to not only develop mutual respect for what nature offers, but to also understand the impact and implications of the decisions and actions that we take based on the very ecosystem that we live in today. So an example of the way that we interact our decisions and actions towards nature is that we often have this desire to control and domesticate nature, to extract its resources without fully respecting the role that it plays in sustaining us. An example of this is that we have domesticated grains, and this is with the intention to increase production, to increase uniformity and quality and taste. And in fact, what's happened to that is that 75% of plant genetic diversity has been lost to us genetically trying to create uniform and high yielding crops. This is also the same when we talk about fiber production for the fashion and textile industry. So to meet consumer demands, we have over-domesticated to get the quality and quantity that we want to meet consumer expectation. But as we start to see the impact of climate change, that's going to threaten the quantity and quality of our food and resource supplies. So it's never been more important for us to explore regenerative approaches to ensure that our ecosystems and habitats will actually enable us to live beyond tomorrow. So during the research, we came across plant physiologist Louis Ziska, who works for the USDA's Agricultural Research Services. And he has been studying weed in food production for many years. And what he did in his test lab is he wanted to mimic the expected conditions of the world in 2050, when an additional 2.6 billion people will be wondering what's for dinner. So what happened was they placed these weeds that we defined as pests, they placed them in predicted conditions expected to be the Earth's norm from 30 years from now, where carbon dioxide levels are equivalent to an urban traffic jam and temperatures are tipping into the dangerous zones for the planet's health. Now, what was really interesting to see from this study was, in comparison to our genetically, high yielding crops, was that rather than these weeds choking from such treatment, the weeds were actually thriving. So it really kind of brings into question, the way that we perceive nature, the way that we can control nature, and the way that we try to cultivate nature to meet our needs and demands. Is there something within that framework that we need to start to question and to address? So how do we then begin to design for this preferable future? How do we begin to design systems, tools, actions, and interactions that will truly foster global change? So our approach within this is that we really believe that we need to change the narrative. We need to start to see nature as equals, as partners, as collaborators, and as our mentors. We need to start to ask nature, not what can we extract from her, but what can we learn from her 3.8 billion years of experimentation. One approach that we've explored is this idea of how do we start to shift from human-centered design to multi-species centered approach. Now, when we talk about human-centered design, this is really about building deep empathy with the people you're designing for. It aims to empower individuals and teams to design products, services, and systems that truly address the core needs of those experiencing a problem. And the foundational principle of human-centered design is that you should truly immerse yourself within that community that will be affected by your design. By experiencing the problems that they face firsthand will enable you to design solutions that truly meet those needs. Now, instead of immersing ourselves in this kind of human environment, what if instead we immerse ourselves in our non-human species environment? Can that begin to enable us to understand, to build empathy, and result in designing in a manner that truly impacts and creates benefits for all? In 2020, we delivered a project titled The Age of, and the ambition of the project was to really take the audience on a journey from present day issues of climate change to a near future where nurture nature, nature made, and ecological models underpin our vision of a new design ecology, to a very far future, a multi-species future, where we foresee that humans recognize that they're neither superior nor inferior to other life forms. And this project really started with this simple question. Is it easier to imagine life on Mars than to take care of life on Earth? As we know, there's a lot of investments at the moment into space travel, into cultivating asteroid mining, into the idea of colonizing Mars. So we really wanted to ask this question because it really feels like instead of trying to solve the problems we have today, are we ultimately colonizing another planet so that we don't have to care for the planet we have at the moment? So with this project, we invited 8 international studios to work with the planet Mars as a projection plane for critique and speculation, to create spaces for discussion and debate about what does it mean to be human on Earth today, and what are the ethical implications of how we behave in relation to our non-human species counterpart. So in essence, what the designers did is they explored different future scenarios that problematize human as superior to nature and our confidence in human-centered technological solutions. The aim of the project was to challenge our current mindsets through multi-species thinking, advocating for non-human rights, whilst also finding ways to design within our planetary means. Now, when we look at nature, nature by default is regenerative. And for millions of years, our global ecosystem has renewed itself through a process of life and decay, decomposition and fertilization. And it's really thanks to the work of many species, processes such as pollination, water and air filtration, carbon sequestration, which have all contributed to the biodiversity, health and resilience of our ecosystems. And it's these ecosystem services that have laid the foundation for regeneration. So we know that species play many different roles in this ecosystem. And some of these roles are in the form of producer to decomposer. So we know that when it comes to producers, these are typically plants, algae, and microorganisms. And their role is that they pull nutrients from the soil, they don't eat other organisms, and they manufacture their own food through photosynthesis. When it comes to consumers, these are species that cannot manufacture their own food, and they need to consume other organisms. And for decomposers like mushrooms, they break down dead plant and animal matter and release it again as energy or nutrients back into the ecosystem. So we know that when it comes to that species play a very, very critical role in sustaining, nourishing us, and ultimately have a key role in our survival. So one approach that we've started to think about, recognizing that our current take, make, waste model really doesn't work in sustaining life. So we started to adopt a more circular approach, which looks at designing waste out of the system and transitioning to renewable energy resources. But really, is this enough? So what we propose in our project, in our scenario, is that what if instead of just taking from nature, we begin to exchange with nature? So the ambition of the project was to really examine a future where nature had equal stake in the design of new products, services, and systems to ensure that it was mutually beneficial for both human and non-human species. Within the scope of the framework, we designed a series of prompts to enable our studios to envisage new scenarios that could foster the design of these systems with both species in mind. And as you saw in the previous slide with the biomass period where man was on top, in this scenario, we asked the question, what happens if man became, instead of being consumers, we took on the role as producers for nature? What does that look like if we had to do that instead? So this is a work by Catherine Disney, who did some research with a scientist called Han Basinger. And what you see on the picture on your, I think it's your right, is that there are bees sipping tears from Han Basinger's eye. Now, everyone knows that tears are salty, they're a rich source of protein, and that each tiny drop can contain 200 times more protein than sweat. Salt is essentially nutrition for the survival and reproduction of living organisms. And it also helps to maintain blood volume and allow cells to stay moist. And sodium even keeps the nerves working properly. However, plants actually have relatively low salt value. So what if, as man's role as a producer, we had to physically cry in abundance to produce enough tears to feed bees? One of the other kind of prompts we looked in was this idea of mutualistic systems, the idea of how do we create exchange systems within a closed loop circular economy. So it was to imagine that, you know, what bodily materials could humans cultivate from themselves to exchange with other species, or what happens if humans have to become a carrier for other species to help them grow and survive. Now, when we look at the human body, almost 99% of the human body is made up of 6 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. And only about 0.85% is composed of another 5 elements. But all of those 11 are necessary for life. However, not all elements which are found in the body, which are called trace elements, play a role within our body. And these elements are often seen as bystander contaminants that don't really have a function. So if we have these trace elements that we don't need, could these actual trace elements potentially be extracted to feed other species in exchange for resources that they could provide us in return? Now, this is a project, one of the studios by Frederick and Plum van Dilk, and they did a project called The Body Garden. And the ambition of this project was really looking at the human body in its entirety to cultivate and understand what aspects of the body do we shed, like hair, nails, skin. Could we take those elements and do they have value that could be converted into nutrients and minerals for other non-human species? So this may sound somewhat far-fetched, but we know that scientist Mark Blenner, who works at the Clemson University, has started to explore the recycling of human waste for astronauts in space. And what he wanted to do was look at the smart way for the future when deep space explorers need to recycle their body waste and create nutritional supplements that can keep them alive, but can also be used as building blocks to keep the ship up and running. So what they had done was taken the waste materials from the humans. He actually was able to genetically engineer yeast, which was then going to be used to create important chemicals for the astronauts, which was omega-3 fatty acids, but at the same time was also able to convert that into plastics, which could also be used for 3D printing on the ship. And then the final kind of scenario prompt that we looked into, as I mentioned, was this notion of a biocircular exchange model. So if you think about today's modern day society, you know, where we go to the shop or we get services rendered, we always exchange or pay for those services. So, you know, with nature, we take from nature, but what do we give in exchange? What do we pay for those services they provided? So the ambition of this particular prompt was to look at the idea of what if we were to play the same service concept mindset to nature as well. So Interface is a carpet company that had the ambitions to achieve net zero by 2020, but they actually achieved that a year early in 2019. So they were on track to be a fully sustainable company who met their objectives. But they didn't want to just continue with business as usual. They wanted to do more than just be sustainable in its traditional sense. So here they really truly used nature as their mentor as they set out to transform the role of factories to move beyond zero footprint to actually provide benefits like healthy ecosystems do. So instead of a purposely made factory designed solely to do one thing, they took into account the surrounding habitats of where the factory is situated to understand what additional ecological services could the factory provide in exchange for what nature already gives them in abundance. So here we see that this company is really starting to shift from solely reducing impact from designing out waste to also designing systems that can replenish and restore what we have taken from nature. Now, our world is complex, it's interconnected, and it's finite, but we don't treat it as it were. It's the way that we in industrialized societies engage with our ecosystems that's degenerative. We have a tendency to separate and simplify, and this is evidenced in everywhere that we look. For example, we use GDP growth as a marker of success. We homogenize our high streets and our fields. We, see human and nature as divisible. But ultimately, our lives are so deeply embedded into the wider ecology, but we actually choose to ignore that. So when we talk about regenerative futures, we need to start to change the way in which we view the world. We need to shift from this human-centered design mindset to more of a multi-species approach, to start to build empathy and care into the systems that we create to ensure that everyone has mutual benefits and mutual equity. And what we also need to remember that humans and nature are not divisible, but we're really one species in a community of 8.7 million. And also there is a community of microorganisms living in and on us. And these microorganisms were seeded by our mothers. And this is our microbiome. It's our non-human half that we cannot live without. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.